With me, among the speakers, from my immediate right, I have Briggs Bomba, who is the Programs Director at Trust Africa. Next to Briggs is Mr. Stephen Karangizi, who is the Senior Advisor at the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa and a member of the Working Group on the Common Africa Position on Assets Recovery. And then next to Steve is Barrister Akere Muna. I'm sure we all heard from him before, who is a member of the Africa Union High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows and the co-chair of the Working Group on Common Africa Position on Assets Recovery. Next to him, a powerful sister, Ms. Suad Aden Osman, the Executive Director of the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa. And lastly is Don Dare, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Pan-Africa Lawyers Union. Barrister, as your first slide comes up, I'd like to welcome you to take us through the journey of illicit financial flows in Africa. What has happened? Where are we? Particularly on the high-level panel report on IFFs. Welcome.
I want to recognize the presence of Joyce Odua, who is the Vice President of PALU from West Africa. President. Yeah. That's what you do when you don't want to get fired, you know what I mean? Well, the outline, I'll just give you a quick outline. I don't know if we have it on, okay, there we go. We'll talk about the work of the high-level panel. I will just quickly introduce you to the CAPAR. I have colleagues here who would go detail about that, the present constitutional arrangements, and the reporting structure on IFS, and of course, we'll look at the focus on the national level response. And before we start looking ahead towards the Thabo Mbeki report number 2, as you know, the HLP was established in 2012 under the leadership and the chairmanship of the former President of South Africa, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. We worked on a report, an exhaustive report, and I have to mention that when the group was created by the finance ministers in 2012, the driving idea behind this is to really assess how much money leaves the continent. Okay, how much money leaves our continent? And when we did our report, we found out one thing, that the aid we get from abroad is only 1/3 of the amount of money that leaves the continent. So we are net creditors. So if we could do something about the bleeding, and that Stop the Bleeding campaign, Don will probably say something about that, we might be able to get our continent to survive on its own means. And that caused the HLP, the high-level panel, to create the first tool, which is the CAPAR, which was adopted by the Executive Council of the African Union. I'll just pause and tell you a small anecdote or what really drives me in this area of governance. It has to do with, I was in a conference, in a meeting in Paris, and there were all these bankers, and there was the head of the IMF and the World Bank. And the World Bank had just put together a tool they call STAR, Stolen Asset Recovery, Initiative, which was supposed to deal with assets that had left. And I stood up and I said, well, excuse me, sir, if you're saying these monies that are abroad are stolen assets, and they're in banks in the West, so maybe these banks are handlers of stolen goods. They are handlers of stolen goods. They are accomplices. So you have to do something about it. They don't have any moral ground to keep the money after it's frozen. Hundreds of millions stolen from the continent, put in the bank, 9, 10 years, and recover this money, no interest, nothing. So the idea is there's no moral basis for the banks that were complicit in the taking of this money to keep the money. So we have to look for a mechanism whereby when monies are frozen abroad, they don't stay with the complicit bank. We move them to an escrow where they can stay. I mean, when I spoke about this 20 years ago, I was laughed at. But guess what? It was adopted by the high-level panel, was approved by heads of states, it's gone to the United Nations, it was looked at by the FACTI panel, and now discussions are around the creation of escrow accounts to which monies that have been pilfered from a continent could go through from the banks. The banks are not very happy about it, but that's not our business. So CAPA also is going to deal with that part of it. I'm sure Steve would look into that. And also, we have a technical committee on domestic resource mobilization. And that is what CODA does. It helps to guide the efforts to foster the high-level research, technical and it gives technical and advocacy support directly to the high-level panel to help us in our work with African governments. It's also to boost the capacity of African governments to be able to adopt, implement efficient fiscal policies as the basis for better revenue collection, public expenditure management, and debt management. You know that there's a lot of talk about the OECD. The OECD is a private sector organization, but through its strength, influence, and power, people look at it as some kind of international organization. But the fiscal policy which the OECD promotes is not for us. It's to protect the interests of these multinationals. So as Africa pushes and tries to develop a global framework for fiscal policy, the pushback is very, very heavy. It's very heavy. And OECD is very smart. They're embedded in all our countries. In every department, revenue department, they have somebody who has been trained, who has been given visits and trips to France and where have you. And they actually, within our own country, work for the OECD. So we have to be careful that those of us who are in the People's Parliament look very closely at any kind of fiscal policy which is coming out of these sources. The next slide, I think, is the one that gives you an idea of the current institutional arrangements. I will just mention, you can see where the high-level panel is, and also the consortium, which will be spoken about later on, which is one of the very first tools that was put in place by the HLP to galvanize expertise and to be able to mobilize grassroots support for the policies and to diffuse as French and to make known the work of the panel. Of course, then the working groups, of which CAPA is the first. And of course, the engine behind all of this is CODA, which more and more is bringing together amazing experts with amazing experience. You know, former ministers, former heads of international organizations, experts in every field. Steve is one of those. He's here, and he'll be able to talk to you. The next thing again is the reporting structure of the high-level high-level panel, you could see that we worked through the African Union, we worked through the APRM. The APRM has a structure and reporting which is very similar to what the HLP does. We do country assessments, APRM does that. We go to those countries to we get consultants who sit there and do a country assessment. We do that. The only difference is that we don't have the closed session where we go and criticize the governments. We just go advise them and say, well, listen, this is what we think can be helpful to you. Now, the next slide actually talks about the national level assessments. Now, the African Financial Integrity Accountability Project, the AFIAP, is really the mechanism which is put into place to make sure we can survive. Again, that is another thing that was put together and created through CODA by the HLP. I mean, you'll see that through all of this, you will see CODA mentioned many times. And the work of CODA really is what connects the HLP to the African citizenry. And so the idea of coming to talk to you is to make sure that we have one voice, unified voice, for us to understand that we, to survive, must fight against IFF. The big sectors are the extractive industries. We have to unite. I will close on my present crusade. My present crusade is against Glencore. Glencore is a trader and a rogue company. I'll repeat this. Glencore is a trader in commodities and a rogue company. They just pleaded guilty in the UK and the US for promoting corruption in 6 countries. One of those is mine, Cameroon. In the case of Cameroon and South Sudan, they admitted in court to have flown a private jet to Cameroon and Sudan. I must add, the private jet came from Nigeria. With suitcases of raw cash to bribe government officials. They admitted that in court. And for doing all that mess, they were fined over $1.4 billion for violating the laws of those countries. What about the 6 African countries? Not a dime. Not a dime. We are the victims, and we have gotten not a dime. It's like going through a traffic light and then paying for the traffic offense, and the person whom you hit doesn't get a franc. And that's what the state of play is. Why? Because of our own leaders. The only country that has tried to do something was DRC, because the new president came into power in 2019. But in the other 5 countries, the same leaders are there. So, of course, we can't even get the names of those they bribed, although they admitted, and they say which companies took the money. So we'll never be able to do that. Maybe this digital discussion might help us know how do we solve this problem. But before then, we'll sit down and wait for the fish to fry themselves. Thank you very much.
Vice President of PALU, so that I keep my practicing license, as I'm a lawyer also. So before I start, you've heard my senior colleague mentioning what the IFF report showed, in that Africa is bleeding. We lose a lot of resources, most of which are out in the Western world. Unfortunately, governments are not likely to pursue them, and you need civil society. I'm so glad to be speaking to civil society about asset recovery, because you get the information, you need to put that information out, put pressure on governments to initiate the actions for asset recovery. But the principal driving factor is the same with the IFF, in that we actually we are a net creditor to those so-called donors. If we could recover most of the assets that are outside, we will be in a better position to balance our budgets, which at the moment we can't, and the debt is already bedeviling us. Don't know why the PowerPoint wasn't uplifted. So that's the first reason. We need the resources. We don't need to stress that. In terms of that response of the resources, the AU then took this declaration with the leadership actually of Nigeria, and we now have a CAPA, a basis on which we can move into action. It is a political, policy, and advocacy instrument. That's why I was saying, please get it if you can't get access to it on the internet, and I would suggest you all look at it, save it on your computers. So this is a declaration on how we can recover those assets that were illicitly flow out of the continent, particularly commercial assets, and still continue to leak out of the continent. And of course, it is related to the fight against corruption. The AU took several decisions in terms of combating corruption. So the framework, as indicated on the next slide, has 4 pillars. These are the 4 pillars that dictate how you can recover assets. I am saying that because I was personally involved. I led the only institution in Africa established on a continent-wide basis, the African Legal Support Facility, established by the AU, that provides that has that responsibility. One of the responsibilities is to trace and recover assets, and we successfully did it for 2 countries. And one of the things we discovered is that the governments themselves are usually reluctant to get involved in this, so we were actually proactive in helping some of the countries in recovering these assets. And when we started the work, one of those who first visited us was STAR, the Stolen Asset Recovery Unit of the World Bank. And my immediate reaction to them was that we are not going to deal with stolen assets. No, we are going to deal with sovereign assets, all assets of our states. So what do those assets mean? Even assets that are taken away through tax avoidance and all those tax-related offenses, and also our cultural artifacts. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of the 4 pillars I have mentioned. The first pillar being detection and identification. There's always a challenge with that. There's always rumor that these assets have flown out and are in country X and so on. Unfortunately, one of the experiences we learned, by the time you locate those assets, they've switched jurisdictions like 5 times. So they might be sent to Switzerland initially. They will leave Switzerland. Within 2 days, they will be in Malaysia, from Malaysia to Dubai, and so on. So that's a major task in terms of the first pillar. Second pillar is then recovery and return. That's even a more complicated process, but I'll get into the detail. Third pillar is those assets. Once you have identified them and you want to return them, and also when you return them, how do you manage them? Then the 4th pillar is cooperation and partnership between us and the West, or where the assets are located. It's no longer just the West, let's just say out of our continent, and also between ourselves, because these days you also have some of the assets being shifted to other African countries. And there are 2 important cross-cutting themes that buttress these pillars, and also in terms of policy recommendations from the CAPA. So in terms of detection and identification, it's absolutely important that we strengthen our existing laws on identifying the assets. This has improved, but it's not yet good enough on the continent. A lot of studies show a lot of countries have not yet strengthened their institutions for the whole process of detection and identification of the assets, and protection of whistleblowers, and of course strengthening of the institutions, making them as strong as possible. In the morning they were talking about misinformation. One of the biggest misinformation sometimes we have is against our anti-corruption institutions. So they will pick out somebody. There was even a lady targeted, head of an anti-corruption agency in one of the African countries, and they fabricated information to give the impression that this was her. So those are the challenges that we need to address. And of course, the most important in terms of pillar one is transparency. And that's where we all come in. In terms of the second pillar, we have to prioritize the recovery. There is a lot of work to do, both at national level and, as Barrister Keremuna indicated, at regional level. It's easier for us to work together. So in fact, the committee in charge of implementing the CAPA is now working on model agreement that the states can use at regional level so that we can sign agreements between ourselves and the European Union, or between ourselves and USA, or between ourselves and, say, China, to recover the assets. It's actually easier on a regional basis. But even on a national basis, we are trying to develop templates to assist the countries. It's also important that in that process of recovery, as indicated, we are already on the next slide, the institutions that we have are strengthened, because recovery is very complex, as I was indicating. Once the assets leave our region, they metamorphose into different forms. So tracing, strengthening the capacity to recover is very important. And exchange of information between ourselves is also absolutely important. The third pillar, as I indicated, is management of those recovered assets. We have to keep saying that those assets belong to us as Africans or African countries, and that we should be the ones to determine who manages those assets. Those who are from Kenya will know that there was a case of assets which were located in one of the offshore states of UK, which had been shifted there by an ex-minister, and the country which had those assets insisted on the way Kenya would use those assets, and I think they gave them some useless assets, useless facilities that the government probably didn't need, and they could have used those assets more meaningfully for some of the sectors that need them. So that's another pillar that I was indicating. In terms of the final leg, the way we should manage those assets, there are very clear recommendations in the CAPA. The need to preserve those assets. So in terms of preserving the assets, the working group on CAPA is recommending that we set up one escrow account in a development bank, such as Continental Development Bank, such as ADB, African Development Bank, or Africa Exim, where those assets should sit while the country is trying to recover them. Because unfortunately, if you lost 10 million in 2010 and you locate it now, if country X locates it now, the host country will insist on paying you the same 10 million, not taking account of all the interest accumulated. So that's one of the recommendations. That's why we are proposing to set up an escrow account where the funds can go and they do not lose value. Of course, continued fight against corruption, demand for compensation for those lost assets. I also mentioned the importance of us working together in terms of recovery of cultural assets and so on. Finally, the issue of cooperation. One of the key recommendations of the CAPA is for us to work together. The governments, the different governments, as I was indicating, it's easier for us on a regional basis to recover those assets rather as a region rather than as an individual country. And the need to increase coherence between our own systems and the systems at regional level and global level. In that way, it will be easier for us to recover those assets. Recovery of assets is always time-bound. When you lose time, you lose the assets. There is need to take account of other cross-cutting issues in terms of gender equality, environmental issues, inclusivity of different groups when you are identifying those assets and what they have lost. And all these are issues that are covered in the policy recommendations of the CAPA, which I have highlighted, you can see. So there is still a lot of work for us to do. And the next steps, we are in the process of creating a proper framework for the implementation of the CAPA so that we have actual action being taken by our countries. And that's where your role comes in terms of continued popularization of the existence of the CAPA so that the necessary action is taken at a continental level. The working group has taken a deliberate decision that going forward, the implementation of the CAPA will be coordinated by the Pan-African Lawyers Union Secretariat. And hopefully our colleague who heads the Secretariat will also comment on it. Thank you very much. All the best as we work together.
Stephen, I think you've brought very salient issues out, and your call for unity, your call for coordination, your call for coherence. Comrades, we were aware that this session was happening immediately after lunch, and therefore we didn't want to bore you with PowerPoints, and as you can see, actually there's power in those points that have been presented. With me here is a group of people representing institutions that actually came together back in 2015 to ensure that we develop a coherent narrative, that we shape that narrative, and that we nurture that narrative to ensure that we don't lose the IFF's agenda and the decisions of the African Union that came as a result of the high-level panel report. To begin this discussion now, we've moved away from presentations, is Briggs. And Briggs, you know, there has been a battle of narratives, you know, words, what should constitute IFFs, yet the high-level panel report was clear on this. We are currently talking about what is illicit. Some people want to define for us or to term it as illegal. So we're experiencing a battle of narrative. And you know, this has also led into different figures being actually put forward. Why is this important, Briggs, especially for Africa, when we're looking at the commercial aspects of illicit financial flows?
Yeah. I serve as the programs director for Trust Africa. You probably had in the morning some of the angles through which we come into the conversation. If I'm to take it off straight from where our moderator has teed it up, we came into the discussion to bring in the African perspective together with allies as part of the IFF consortium coordinated by my dear sister here under CODA, and then involving other actors, Pan-African Lawyers Union, Tax Justice Network Africa, AFRODAD, FEMNET, International Trade Union Council. We realized from the very beginning that the relevance of this conversation lied in it reflecting the specificities within which, as an African continent, we were affected by the problem. So when we interacted a discussion that centered the illegality part of it. We realized that there was actually a conceptual battle that needed to be fought. And at that conceptual level, our submission from the very beginning has been that when we are talking about illicit financial flows from Africa, we are not just talking about illegality, but we are talking about the unjustified, the unconscionable, the terrible ways in which wealth that is generated and created on the continent crosses our borders and ends up in other jurisdictions. We were supported in this endeavor by some of the very empirical research that was done by African researchers like your Ndikumanas, who, before the terminology of illicit financial flows had emerged, and the conversation at that point was about capital flight. And the argument was that there is capital flight from Africa because we don't have attractive investment opportunities. We didn't have stable enough environments. They ran very sound economic regressions that proved that there was no relationship between the flight, so-called flight of capital from the continent, and all these parameters. And that led to a conclusion that said if it wasn't about this, then there were illicit motives. So from how we have come into the conversation as the IFF Consortium, as Trust Africa and our partners, is to say the discussion around illicit financial flows must really focus at all the ways in which wealth, assets that are generated from the continent mysteriously and in all the other ways that we know find themselves crossing our borders and ending in all these other jurisdictions. And when you go further, if you take the high-level panel report that has been talked about since this morning, we also then realize that whereas the report identifies 3 major sources of illicit financial flows from the continent and classifies them as 1, the commercial aspect, secondly, the illegal aspect, and thirdly, the corrupt aspect. For the African continent, the most relevant source of illicit financial flows is the commercial aspect, is the tax-related aspect. It accounts for no less than 65% of the wealth that is being siphoned from the continent and ending up in other jurisdictions. They calculated that only about 5% of this phenomenon accounted to corruption. And in that case, corruption was defined as bribery of state officials and theft of public assets by state officials. It was only accounting to about 5%. And then about 30% was now accounting to illegal activities, right? So we cannot dismiss the importance of focusing on money laundering, focusing on financing for terrorism. But when we come to our continent, the most significant aspect of illicit financial flows is tax and commercial activity related. And you can unpack that even deeper. And when you go into that, you then realize that we have particularly vulnerable sectors from the continent, and the extractive sector is the biggest of them all. And we all know that we are always saying as Africa, we can't be this rich in terms of natural resources and this poor in terms of the human development indicators and outcomes. But our wealth in natural resources is being compromised by the fact that our natural resources sector is the biggest source of illicit financial flows in the world. In fact, it accounts for around 70% of IFFs that are coming from Africa. And the important empirical studies that have already been done that show us that it's mostly your high value and lightweight minerals products that are most susceptible to illicit financial flows. So we're talking about gold, we are talking about diamonds, we are talking about now, because these studies were a few years back, we are talking about lithium, we are talking about cobalt. These are the mineral resources that can catapult us beyond even what we imagined in terms of the sustainable development goals. They are the most susceptible to illicit financial flows. And secondly, our financial services sector is the most susceptible to illicit financial flows. And I'll say that a little bit as I'm concluding, because it's a global question now. The question of reforming global finance or the global financial architecture. Thirdly, our telecommunication sector is the third most susceptible when it comes to illicit financial flows from the continent. So I think as we meet here under the auspices of ECOSOC, and we are galvanizing an African citizen's voice, it's important that the song that we sing, the dance that we dance, the narrative that we project really reflects these issues from our experience as African citizens and how it affects our countries and how it undermines our aspirations, our hopes for a more just global society, for a more just continent. So I want to come to the last point that I will speak to, and as I sit down, it's around the solutions that we are projecting. So of course we have said, let us win the narratives battle around this. The conversation built up with global North institutions that had millions of funds to support research, right? It's very difficult to find a single African institution that can actually have $100,000 per year to invest in research. But they did this research from the global North. We know that the global North features into this equation mostly as a destination of illicit financial flows. We feature as a source of illicit financial flows. So it's a bigger problem for us. But secondly, part of why we are the most affected by illicit financial flows is just how the global financial architecture is currently defined and organized. We are currently living under rules that were negotiated at the end of the First World War, not even the Second World War, the First World War. When if there was a multinational corporation, it was just one company living one country in the global North and then operating in another country in the global South. But right now we are in a world where the nature of the multinational corporation has completely changed. It's now a hydra with 9 heads. If you chop off one head, by the time you're at the 4th head, the first head has come up already. Multinational corporations have these most sophisticated structures that take advantage of the current architecture to the extent that we will not even be able to know how to understand them and where to tax them. But the basics of the negotiation of international tax cooperation at the end of the First World War was focused on trying to avoid double taxation. And the agreements that emerged then said the countries, capital exporting countries from which these multinational corporations are resident were coming from will have a right to tax on what we can call return on investments. And the source countries where the economic activity is taking place will have a right to tax on profits. And because you have a multinational corporation that's operating in 7, 9, 10, and even more countries, they became very good at making sure that you will never know where they made money, where they made profits from. Because we don't have what's called country-by-country reporting. It's just consolidated reports that come up at the end of the day. So even if you look at the high-level panel reports that President Thabo Mbeki and the high-level panel produced, they cite companies that operated for more than 10 years without declaring a profit. Because you can play the rules to make sure that you keep operating, but you never declare profits in the country that you're operating. That's why this question of base erosion and profit shifting is important for the African continent. So we are at a place where we need to renegotiate international tax cooperation. And the processes that are happening at the UN level right now, as a result of the success of the efforts by Pan-African institutions and civil society on the continent that have really pushed to say we must reform global taxation rules, are extremely, extremely important. Because we now need to shift this equation so that multinational corporations can report on a country-by-country basis. Because they're making money in our countries, but they're declaring losses in our countries. So at the end of the day, we cannot tax them. So it really takes us to the point of the reforms to the global financial architecture that needs to happen right now. And Comrade Chair, if you allow me, someone talked about 0 seconds, I'll just close on that point. When we are talking about the reforms to the global financial architecture, I'm always urging colleagues, comrades, us as a generation to take this matter as a matter of extreme importance right now. Right after the end of the Second World War, when you hear about the Bretton Woods institutions, the best Western country economists sat for 3 weeks uninterrupted. To us, a 2-day meeting is a stress. They sat for 3 weeks with no stop in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And that's where they defined the architecture that defined global finance post the Second World War. And of course, it was defined in the interest of the victors. We have a new opportunity right now because of the all-encompassing global crisis that is confronting us to really speak an African voice into what is our interest in a new global financial architecture that will shape maybe the next 100 years and maybe even beyond the next 100 years. This is not a small matter. If we don't pay attention to it, it's going to be defined again by those who were responsible for the last era. There will be the same voices that will shape the next 100 years. So we really need to bring our voices as a coordinated Pan-African citizenry voice to say, as Africa, this is what we want to see. If our time had permitted, I was going to speak to some of the key components that I believe as the African continent must constitute the core ideas of that global financial architecture reform. But let me leave it at this point and just thank you for your attention.
Just on country-by-country reporting, I don't know how many of us saw last week that OECD actually watered down a law or a bill that was being discussed in Australia so as to protect multinational companies. But just by show of hands, it was in the Financial Times just this week. And that just shows us that OECD actually exists to protect the interests of multinational corporations. And it's OECD that has been defining the tax rules. You know, when I started this journey, I used to ask myself, why is it that we have all these UN bodies? You have UNICEF, WFP, FAO, UNDP, but there's no UN tax body. You know, it's deliberate, it's by design, right? Thanks so much, Comrade Briggs. To my brother, Don. Different conversations have been happening from Dakar to Livingstone. Could you just speak to us about these discussions and the outcome of these discussions, particularly the last one being in Livingstone? Thanks.
An African position. And the Common African Position does two things. One, it lays out the law in Africa. And then two, it's also like a campaign tool where we're telling the global north, when we identify our assets, can we have them in the shortest time possible? And in the interim, if you're going to subject us to legal processes, for instance, to court processes in your countries, for us to prove that that money is ours or that other asset is ours, then can it be sitting in an escrow account that we control first? Should we lose the case, it goes back to the person. Should we win the case, we have our money with interest, and it's been in an institution where it was helping the African people and not making rich people richer. So really, in Livingstone, 2 months ago, the high-level panel met, and its various working groups and committees met, including the one on CAPA, and they laid out a plan of action for the rest of the year. It had elements like making sure we make a strong statement at the International Anti-Corruption Conference at the end of the year. It had elements like making sure that we inform properly UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which is the treaty body under ANCAC, the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, that we inform them clearly of our position and get their buy-in. And it had action points around what we're doing now. Raise awareness amongst African people, African citizens and African civil society. Remind them that this agenda is important, that the money we require that money now to buy medicines and build clinics and build hospitals, to buy books and build schools, to build our infrastructure, to finance the base for the African Continental Free Trade Area. So really we should all go into campaign mode, in our daily lives, help trace these assets and help demand that the assets come to us as soon as possible. So the last stop, we're talking to the lawyers of Africa last week, and we talked about these things, and we got their buy-in on a number of things to be much more proactive, including using strategic litigation, becoming more proactive. When our own citizens working within governments begin doing whistleblowing, they'll be under attack. So that part of what we're asking the legal profession to contribute is to contribute to the protection of actors who will be engaging in the fight against corruption and fight against IFF. And one of the tasks actually of the working group, the CAPA working group officially, is to try and define a whistleblower protection regime for the continent. Thanks.
Spoken about the need for a united voice, the need for coordination, the need for coherence in terms of narrative. How do we achieve this, Suad?
When the OECD launches its so-called inclusive framework, we want to be at the table. It's fine, but when it's not a table for you, because when you are a government and it is not an intergovernmental organization that you can instruct, then you're not at the table. So it boils down to the same thing. You must have your own institution. You must make sure that your leadership picks it. And you must make sure that the solutions are African solutions that you will come up with and you will uphold. And that's what the panel, so everybody talks about the high-level panel. This is the report we went by. We are preparing the second one, the Mbeki 2, we call it, is commonly called Mbeki study or Mbeki 1. We have been saying we must track what's going on, stop it, that was the Stop the Bleeding campaign and everything else, and then get it is to continue to research it, understand what is going on, but also recover and make sure that we return what left our shores. The high-level panel defined the issue from an African perspective. There's a lot of discourse out there, people are redefining it, they can redefine it. But we can be part of that conversation, but we must know that whether it is 50 billion, 80 billion or not, even if it is 10% of it, it's huge for the needs we have. So it's about understanding the phenomenon and trying to stop it and making sure that these resources are going back where we try to measure it. Measuring it as a very sophisticated method, it's a phenomenon that is meant to hide and make what is wrong right. So you're on estimations. There are not better methods than others, but everybody is going to try. And it's fine. But again, all of that will feed into global and regional level conversations, and you can at best advocate. But moving from talking about the issue to fixing the issue is where the thing lies and the provision lies. And we're talking about national level actions. What are the countries, what is happening in each of our countries? And so the fixing part of it is a national level action, and that's where Barrister Muna, who is a panel member, was saying that the panel is now focusing on national level actions. That is to go in each of the countries and say where you made these decisions. They're no longer, the report, findings and recommendations were adopted by the Assembly of Heads of State. They are no longer recommendations of a panel, they are decisions of Heads of States. They are therefore implementable by each of our 55 African Union countries. So national level action is by way of saying, we will assess what we are doing. Have you been acting on it? Yes, what has happened? And then maybe come up with country-specific measures to deal with the issue while we feed into the conversation at regional, sub-regional, regional, global levels. So multiple challenges so far, coordination challenges, of course, implementation of something this big is, you have many actors, it's a multiple actors trying to coordinate ourselves and coherent. We are a member of a core group that stick around the panel since they were actually working on the issue. We are still around them. Some of us have different approach to it, but everybody is trying to deal with it. So I think that one of the ways we're doing it is what Don actually explained, is to pick one part of it and say we will deal with it, forge a common position and organize ourselves to actually capacitate ourselves to deal with it from our own perspective. Now, the challenges of implementation, as you rightly mentioned, there are many actors. The issue is now taxation issue, global tax cooperation issues. Africans are trying to move it away from the OECD to the UN, because at least we are at the table of the UN. And that one is another ball game. A lot is being said, a lot is being redefined for us because we have now changed another. So the focus has to be on what we are doing ourselves, how we see things, and what we do about it. And I think until Mbeki 2 comes up, and we know exactly what it is, that we would really suggest that these two are the guiding, these are the two that made it, went through rigorous research, and are purely African stand on this matter. And I think it's important to know where to get your information from, because it's going to continue to be confusing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You can see hands have come up. I think I'll take a stack and then we'll get back to the panelists.
Towards the barrister. As far as legality of concern, ever since the advent of 2008 global economic crisis at Cairo, Egypt, can you also give a proportionate emphasis on the aspect of the BRICS phenomenon that was just touched on a bit, vis-a-vis the de-dollarization aspect that is taking much toll? Pursuant to time, Amunyango Lennox Ndeda Civil Engineering, Earthquake Focus, 5th year. Thank you very much.
My question is simple. Why do whistleblowers never get the justice which they presume to get? For example, he's talked about IFFs. I may be working in government. I may know they are stealing. What will happen to me if I tell that truth? Will I live or will I die? And the next question is, do you believe that the young people who are coming after me, after seeing so many people die, whistleblow, will whistleblow or steal? So if the panelists can answer that question, why I should tell the truth, then...
Thank you.
I have read the document, and the heads of state adopted this report in 2015, and that is before it was actually accredited by the Nigerian president. I want to know if there has been any progress, or any country has been put on notice that following by the CAPA. And I'll also wish to know who will be your source of data whether it is the anti-corruption bodies in individual countries or it is the host countries. Because if the host countries are the source of data, there's a high chance that we might not get the truth. Thank you.
Level at the Executive Council level, even the heads of assembly level at in Addis Ababa. I must say it's been a very long struggle getting CAPA adopted, but more important, more difficult is the implementation of CAPA. My question, therefore, to Mr. Stephen would be, CAPA does not involve signature of binding agreements on a bilateral basis, on a multilateral basis among member states. And if that's the case, what's the likelihood of member states on a bilateral or multilateral level going in to sign these agreements? And even if they do, as some of our brilliant colleagues said, there is money laundering or whatever else you call it, pilfering of assets, even at top political leaders level in Africa. How would that be implemented? How would any agreement signed, bilateral or multilateral, be actually implemented in effect? And what will be the potential success rate of that type of action on our African continent? Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen Karangizi, you talked about the IFF. My question goes directly that do you protect the asset recovery that has been flown from maybe abroad to Africa in the interest of Africans or our friends from the other side? And then my second concern goes to Barrister Akere about the IFF policy that provide the guidelines in regards to illicit financial flows when it comes to asset recovery. Thank you so much.
Les dirigeants eux-mêmes ou des proches du pouvoir qui sont à la base de la situation. Parce que nous savons tous que le grand problème que nous avons, c'est ça. C'est-à-dire que c'est les personnes souvent qui doivent combattre cela qui sont les premières personnes à le faire. Donc, dans ces conditions-là, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Est-ce qu'il ne faudrait pas peut-être une institution supranationale, sous-régionale ou continentale avec un mandat accepté et clair? S'il faut cela, selon vous, quel devrait être ce mandat-là? Ensuite, est-ce que l'une des difficultés n'est pas dans certains pays le faible taux de bancarisation? Quand je prends l'Afrique de l'Ouest, principalement le Mali, le Burkina, le taux de bancarisation est très faible au niveau des populations. Mais pourtant, au même moment, vous trouvez des gens qui sont capables de vous faire des transferts de 2 millions d'euros sans passer par aucune banque. C'est-à-dire que vous allez voir quelqu'un dans le marché à Bamako, vous lui dites que vous avez un frère à Paris, il faut lui remettre là-bas 2 millions d'euros. Et ils vont faire le transfert, mais sans passer par aucune banque. Donc, quelles peuvent être les solutions à des situations de ce genre? Merci.
Did misusing public office for private gain, refusing to pay tax, trading while he was a public official. We saw Boris Johnson with his COVID scandals, including corruptly giving his friends COVID tenders at inflated prices. Sarkozy is in jail, you know, prosecuted for corruption and so on, and our leaders do it too. So obviously, we're much more concerned about what our leaders do. But the real reason is power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The question then is, what will we do about it? And I think we should direct our energy well. Both Seward and Briggs have given you a computation of what we lose. The kind of corruption and bribery that you're talking about is 5% of our problem. Then the one related to crimes, the crimes of launderings and the crimes of traffickings, is 35% of our problem. Then trade and commerce-based IFFs is 65% of the problem. Now the challenge is we've put ourselves in a situation where we're spending 95% of our time complaining about 5% of the problem, and only 5% of our time complaining about 95% of the problem, especially the important 65% of the problem, you know. So we must go after the corrupt, our corrupt leaders and their enablers, the legal profession, the bankers, the accountants and so on, the fixers, the kitchen cabinets that help them steal from us. But we also must go for where we are losing the majority of our money. On the issue of BRICS, I agree. I support a sort of democratization of the global order, a sort of diversification of the global order. That's why it's important for there to be initiatives like BRICS. But it's also important for us to remember our own other initiatives and put energy in them. For instance, Afrexim Bank has recently established the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. They were launching it, they were discussing it across the road in KICC, where the 14th High-Level Private Sector Forum is also ongoing. So these are ways in which African states can trade among themselves and payments can be made by companies without having to go the dollar route. It saves us time, it saves us money, it increases trade, especially in the context of the FCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we must put energy in things like that and make sure our states are doing what ought to be done. We've got legal instruments that have been adopted at the AU level that could potentially set up an African Central Bank, an African Monetary Institute, as a precursor to an African Monetary Fund, and so on. And the states are not ratifying. So our energy should be to push the states to make sure we ratify this so that we've got a stronger infrastructure within the continent, but also a stronger platform to debate and negotiate globally. And as Briggs said, with the UN Tax Convention, the process towards the UN Tax Convention, where Nigeria, the government of Nigeria has been given good leadership, that we continue pushing all our states. So people like the host president here, who gives very good Pan-African speeches, tell him to match speeches by action, by we seeing a raft of ratifications of the legal instruments that say those things that are in his nice speeches, and then let him be a champion to get his leaders across the region to do the same. So beyond speeches. And as for the fear on whistleblowers, there are brave people still. And I think it's more to celebrate the brave people that gave us the African component on the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the state capture report in South Africa and Kenya. So it's about how we strengthen those who are brave enough to speak through law, through policy, but also through protest. Also through protest, through art, through song, through dance, through everything, and to holding to accountable anybody that might threaten them. Thank you.
Let's focus on those stealing our future. Building on that, Briggs, the business question.
Oh. Sorry. No. Oh, it doesn't come, eh? I have to move to the table. All right. So Don has pretty much answered, I think, all the questions that came from the floor. I would just like to associate myself with the responses that he gave and maybe make a more general closing statement. And it's to do with what confronts us when we're looking at the reforms to the global financial architecture. Sometimes it sounds very abstract, so it's very difficult for us to speak intelligibly in terms of what needs to be done. And I want to submit that at the core of it, we are actually talking about going back to the economic model that underpins how we understand economics, organized society, and currently, the basis of that is this assumption that completely unregulated financial markets will act in our best interest as everyone. They will get benefits for everyone. So you've had, if you want to go back 2008, the financial crisis that started in the US, everything is deriving from this completely unregulated financial markets. And I want to submit that part of what we need to do is to go back to regulating these financial markets, demanding licensing for certain financial products that are creating havoc for the world. And secondly, we need a more democratic decision-making system to come into place. And this is why the conversations about a UN tax convention are extremely critical for us. Because currently decisions are being made at the OECD level, at the G20 level, at the G7 level. Actually, the most important decisions are just 7 countries that are making those. So we really need to demand a more democratic decision-making framework at a global level so that our own interests as African countries are taken care of when we're talking about tax justice, when we're talking about stopping illicit financial flows, and we're talking about a more just society. Thank you.
Thank you, Briggs. Stephen, Briggs has taken some of your time, so in 45 seconds.
Speaking in 0 minutes. There are two specific questions I was asked of. I'll start with the reverse, because the second one I was going to answer, I see the ambassador's moved out. I hope somebody will relay. Oh, it's here. Oh, okay, thank you. I need glasses. Oh, they're here. Yeah, so the first one is on implementation of the frameworks. In fact, the whole problem with our continent is our weakness in knowing what is available to us. And that's why we are developing a framework which will come through your channels. That is the AU channels, including the ambassadors. And I hope, Ambassador, you will really help us in championing it, which will simplify the processes for recovery, enforcement, and so on. For instance, one of the unused instruments is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which includes provisions on asset recovery. Most of our countries, when they identify assets, let's say sitting in Switzerland, immediately they are told, prove to us that they are your assets. When you look at ANCAC, there are enough provisions to force Switzerland to accept that those assets originated from us. The obligation is on them to prove that those assets which flowed from our state are not ours, but it is the reverse. Their attitude is, let sleeping dogs lie. So in fact, we are developing the framework so that we can reinforce on a more continental and regional basis the recovery of those assets. And I am very confident that those simplified frameworks will help. Look at the cultural artifacts, how long it took Ethiopia to recover their cultural artifacts and many others. If it was on a more regional basis, it would be easier to enforce. The second question related to protection of recovery assets. One of the key features of the framework will be adopting best practices for many other things, including management of recovered assets. We have studied the best practices. One of the best practices is Nigeria. Nigeria passed a law, I don't know whether it's last year or the year before, which they call Proceeds of Crime Recovery and Management of the Assets, which is really excellent because it provides as to where you put the assets, mainly into the consolidated fund, and also allowing for some assets the institutions that pursue recovery can use for recovery because it's a very expensive process. But we will be providing examples of best practices like that one, because most of the countries do not even have the laws how to manage those assets. And what do they tell you as soon as you identify that the assets are sitting in their country? Where are you going to put the assets? Let's buy ambulances here in Switzerland, which nobody needs. In Africa, you need medicines and education for our children, and then you're forced to buy useless assets. I should have given another example for Nigeria. When they recovered all the assets for Abacha, they were able to account for every single dollar, and that was a lot of money, $500 million. They used it for power, education, health, and so on. So we have best practices I believe we can pursue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Barrister?
Thank you, Stephen. Je vais parler de la question que vous avez posée en ce qui concerne ces institutions, la possibilité d'une institution transnationale dans cette affaire. C'est ce que vous posez comme question. Est-ce que les poissons peuvent se briser? Et il y a une initiative qui a commencé maintenant pour la création d'une cour internationale de lutte contre la corruption. Il y a 2 ans, quand j'ai entendu parler de cette idée, j'étais contre. J'ai dit, c'est pas vrai. Ils vont nous faire un cour pénal international bis, ça sera pour les Noirs et tout. Mais dites-vous bien, depuis la fête Glencore, j'ai changé d'avis. Vous avez 6 pays où c'est prouvé, admis que des leaders ont été corrompus. Mais personne ne fait rien. Parce que ce sont ceux qui sont aux affaires qui doivent déclencher les poursuites. Mieux encore, il y a le Malabo Protocol, donc Don avait contribué à l'écriture, qui était prévu pour donner une juridiction en matière de corruption, n'est-ce pas, à la cour à Arusha. Mais à ce jour, aucun pays n'a ratifié. Peut-être on parle du Maroc, mais ce n'est pas clair. En tout cas, il nous en faut 15, mais aucun. Parce que ceux qui commandent la ratification, ce sont les mêmes qui se sentent concernés. Alors, moi, je tends à dire que bon, tant pis. Si ça va aider les citoyens, allons-y, qu'il y ait une juridiction internationale. Comme ça, vous et moi, on peut aller là-bas, on dit, écoutez, messieurs, voilà des jugements qui montrent un tel président, un tel autre, n'est-ce pas, à voler, donc, tant pis. C'est ce que je pense. And to the question somebody asked, why do they steal? They steal because of us. Our politics, the amount of money you need to campaign, T-shirts, rice, bread, and what have you. We ask for this. Some borrow the money, and afterwards, where do they get the money to pay? They steal again. So I think it is, we have to wait from both sides. And civil society again has a huge role to play. Because civil society is okay, you know, in the 90s, there are many friends I had in civil society. After 10 years, they were beyond recognition. They used to say NGO meant next government official. Okay, so we have to know we have a special role to play, i.e. to get our citizens to understand that the voting is the only chance they have to change things. And they can't just kiss it away because of a T-shirt. They will know that the change they are looking for depends on the pressure they can put. And so I think, yes, they steal. Yes, they will take some more. Because for the next elections, they need the money. It's the chicken and egg story. So I think it's a collective kind of thing for us to do. And if we don't do that, well, you know, I don't know where we are headed. But the question remains what I said before and what my friend from Mali just said. Can the fish fry themselves?
Thank you so much. Swad?